Everyone laughed when he cut a hole in his house until the deadliest blizzard hit. John lived in a small town tucked away in the Midwest, where winters were long and harsh. Every year, the town would brace for the freezing temperatures that would settle over the land like a heavy, cold blanket. The snow would fall in thick layers, and the wind would howl through the streets. It was the kind of cold that made you want to stay inside, curled up by the fire, with a cup of hot chocolate in hand. But for John, the winter months were always a challenge. His old house was drafty and cold, no matter how many blankets or heaters he tried to use. The walls, thick with age, seemed to suck the warmth right out of the air, and no matter how high he cranked the thermostat, it always felt like the cold was winning. John wasn't the kind of person to sit back and accept problems. He was resourceful, always coming up with creative ideas to solve whatever came his way. His friends and neighbors in the town would often joke about his eccentricity. They loved him, but they couldn't always understand his unusual ways of thinking. One winter, as the snow began to fall earlier than usual, John grew tired of the constant battle against the cold. He knew there had to be a better way to keep his house warm without spending a fortune on heating bills. After all, the bills kept rising every year and his budget was getting thinner. That's when John had an idea. It wasn't a small idea, it wasn't a typical solution, it was big. He decided that the only way to keep his house warm and save on those ridiculous heating bills was to make a change to the house itself. He wanted to install a ventilation system, but not just any system. John's plan was to cut a hole in the side of his house and install a makeshift air circulation system that would help manage the airflow and keep the heat inside. He thought that if he could get the air moving in the right way, it would help the house retain warmth for much longer. At first, when John mentioned his idea, people didn't take him seriously. His family thought it was just another one of his wild ideas. "John, you can't just cut a hole in the side of your house," his brother said with a laugh. "That'll make it colder." John's friends in the town were just as skeptical. They chuckled when they saw him carrying a pile of tools, looking more like a mad scientist than a man trying to fix a problem. "What's he up to now?" someone asked, shaking their head. "Cutting holes in his house, that's not going to work." Despite the laughter and teasing, John wasn't deterred. He knew that sometimes the best solutions were the ones that seemed the strangest. If he could make his house more efficient in holding heat, it would be worth any challenge. So he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The process wasn't easy. John spent days measuring, planning, and preparing. He wasn't a professional, but he had learned enough over the years to handle this kind of project. He used a small saw to carefully cut a hole in the side of his house, right near the base of the wall where the cold air seemed to sneak in. It was a messy job, and as he worked, his clothes were covered in dust and wood chips. His arms ached, but he kept pushing forward. As he cut the hole, more and more neighbors stopped by to watch, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing out loud. "He's gone crazy," one of them muttered. "That's going to ruin his house for sure." John didn't mind the attention. In fact, he kind of liked it. He enjoyed proving people wrong, especially when they didn't believe in his ideas. So he focused on the task at hand, determined to finish the job. The process was slow, and every time he took a break, he could hear the whispers and the laughs from the town. "Can you believe it? He really thinks cutting a hole in his house is going to work," they would say, but John just smiled. He was used to being underestimated. This wasn't the first time people had laughed at his ideas. The hole grew larger with every cut. As the day went on, John could feel the cold air creeping in, but he was focused. The walls of his house, once sturdy and unyielding, now seemed more fragile than ever, as if they were just waiting for the storm that would soon come. Finally, after hours of cutting, John stepped back and surveyed his work. The hole was big enough for him to install the makeshift system. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and in his mind, that was all that mattered. He had tried something different, something no one else had thought of. John took a deep breath and began installing the ventilation system. It wasn't a fancy system, just a few basic pipes and vents that he had cobbled together from leftover materials. But he knew it would work. As the system came together, he could feel a sense of accomplishment, even though the laughter from his neighbors continued in the background. The system wasn't much to look at. It was simple, even crude. But it was his solution, and that was all that mattered. John couldn't wait to see if it would work. He didn't expect a miracle, but he hoped that the house would feel just a little warmer than usual. The next few days were cold. The wind howled and the snow piled up outside, but inside John's house, something was different. The air felt warmer, not drastically warmer, but just enough to make a difference. John smiled to himself. Maybe, just maybe, his crazy idea had worked, and though the neighbors continued to joke and laugh, deep down, John knew that he was onto something. It wasn't long before he would prove them all wrong. John stood in the middle of his living room, wiping the sweat from his brow. His hands were sore from all the work he had done, but he couldn't help but feel proud. The hole was cut, the pipes were installed, and everything was in place. It wasn't a perfect system, but John knew it was his last shot at making his home bearable through the long, cold winter. If this didn't work, he wasn't sure what else he could do. The ventilation system was basic. It didn't look like much. There were no fancy ducts or polished metal parts like you'd find in a commercial system. Just a series of pipes leading into the hole he had cut in the side of the house, connected to a couple of vents that he had fashioned together. It was a simple idea, but sometimes the simplest solutions worked best. John had spent hours researching and planning, and now it was time to see if his idea could truly make a difference. The cold was already starting to creep back in. The wind outside howled against the house, and John could feel the chill seeping through the walls. He turned on the small fan that was part of his system, watching as the air began to circulate, pushing warmth from the center of the house out toward the cold corners. He could see the air moving in front of him, swirling just above the floor, and he felt a flicker of hope. John didn't expect the house to suddenly feel like a tropical paradise, but if he could make it even just a little warmer, it would be a huge improvement. He stood there for a while, waiting, watching, hoping. Slowly, he began to notice a change. The room felt warmer, not much, but it was enough to make him smile. The system was working. He spent the rest of the day tweaking the system, adjusting the airflow, checking the pipes to make sure they were securely in place. It was all coming together. The house wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been in years. John knew that, even though the rest of the town thought he was crazy, he had found a solution that would help him survive the coming winter. That evening, after a long day of work, John sat down with a cup of tea and looked out of the window. The snow was falling gently outside, blanketing the world in a soft, white layer. The streets were quiet, the town already tucked away for the night. John took a deep breath, feeling the warmth that now filled his house. It wasn't perfect, but it was his work. He had made it happen. As he sat there, lost in thought, he couldn't help but hear the whispers from the past few days, the laughter, the jokes, the mocking glances. Everyone had told him he was wasting his time. They had all thought he was crazy, cutting holes in his house, building a makeshift system. But now, as the warmth spread through his home, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had all laughed, but now he was the one with the last laugh. But John didn't have long to enjoy his success. The weather forecast had predicted snow, but no one had expected the storm that was heading their way. The townspeople went about their business, assuming it would be like any other winter storm, some snow, maybe a bit of wind, but nothing too serious. John had learned long ago not to trust weather forecasts, but even he couldn't have predicted what was about to happen. As the evening wore on, the wind picked up, and the sky turned an ominous shade of gray. The snow, which had been falling gently just hours before, began to fall in thick, heavy sheets, coming down faster and harder with every minute. It was the kind of snowstorm that seemed to have no end. By midnight, the storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled, tearing through the streets, and the temperature plummeted. The snow fell in blinding sheets, piling up in drifts against the windows. John could hear the wind rattling the walls, shaking the house as if it might collapse at any moment. He stood by the window, watching the storm rage outside, and realized that the worst of it was just beginning. He wasn't worried, though. His ventilation system was working, keeping the house warmer than it had ever been. John had done what he could to prepare, and now all he had to do was wait. As the storm raged outside, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had made the right choice. The others had laughed at him, but now his system was keeping him safe from the worst winter storm he had ever seen. Outside, the world was quickly becoming a white, swirling nightmare. The streets were already covered, and the snow kept piling up. The wind whipped through the town with a fierceness that rattled even the toughest of houses. John had always known that living in such a remote place could be dangerous, especially during the winter months. but he had never seen a storm like this. This wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a blizzard, a force of nature that seemed to have no mercy. As the night wore on, John's house began to feel more and more isolated. The power went out, leaving the town in darkness. The wind howled louder, the snow piling up higher and higher. But inside John's house, it was warm. The air circulated, and the system he had built kept the warmth from escaping. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to survive the storm. The storm raged for hours, and as the night stretched on, John began to wonder how the others were holding up. He knew that many of the houses in town weren't built to withstand such severe weather. The houses were old like his own, and most of them weren't equipped for blizzards of this magnitude. He couldn't help but think about his neighbors, those who had laughed at him. What were they doing now? Were they cold? Were they trapped in their homes, struggling to stay warm? The thought bothered him, but he knew he had to focus on the present. His house was warm, and that was all that mattered. The storm would pass, and when it did, he would be the one who came out on top. He had prepared for this. He had made his own solution, and now it was paying off. As the morning light began to filter through the windows, the storm showed no signs of stopping. The wind was still fierce, and the snow kept falling in thick, heavy layers. John went to the window and looked out at the snow-covered landscape. The world was a frozen wasteland, completely blanketed in white. There was no sign of life, no movement in the streets. The town was silent, as if the blizzard had swallowed everything whole. John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done what he set out to do. His idea, the one everyone had laughed at, had worked. His house was warm, and he was safe. The storm might have taken over the town, but inside John's home it was different. He had created a solution when everyone else had thought there was none. But John knew that the worst was yet to come. The storm was only beginning, and he didn't know how long it would last. He had no idea how bad it would get. But for now, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled up in drifts, John felt a sense of peace. His idea had worked, and that was all that mattered. The blizzard didn't stop. The snow fell relentlessly, as though the storm had a mind of its own, covering everything in sight. The wind howled through the trees, bending them to its will, and the temperature continued to drop, making the world outside feel like an ice-cold prison. Inside John's house, though, things were different. The warmth from his makeshift ventilation system spread through the rooms, holding back the bitter cold that threatened to take over. The fire he had built in the small stove flickered steadily, adding another layer of warmth to the house. As the storm raged on, John stood by the window, looking out at the world turned to white. The storm wasn't just any snowstorm, it was the worst blizzard he had ever seen, and it wasn't showing any signs of stopping. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving the town in total darkness. The streets were empty, no one daring to venture outside in the freezing winds. It was as though the storm had taken hold of the entire town, trapping everyone in their homes. The town that had once been so full of life now seemed abandoned, swallowed by the storm. But inside John's house, he was safe. The cold wind couldn't get in, and the warmth from the stove and ventilation system kept him comfortable. John felt a quiet sense of relief. He had prepared for this moment, and his hard work was paying off. His idea, the one everyone had laughed at, was the very thing that was keeping him alive right now. As the storm continued to howl outside, John sat back in his favorite chair, his feet up on the small wooden table. He sipped his tea and listened to the wind whistle through the cracks in the house. There was no one else around, just the soft crackling of the fire and the relentless roar of the storm. It was hard to believe that only a few days ago he had been laughed at by everyone. His neighbors, his friends, and even his own family had called him crazy for cutting a hole in his house. "You'll regret it," they said. "It's going to make things worse." They had all been wrong. Now, as the storm continued to rage outside, John felt a small sense of triumph. His system was working. His house was warmer than most of the homes in the town. And even though he was alone, even though the rest of the world seemed buried under snow, John felt confident. His idea had been laughed at, but it had turned out to be the only thing that could help him survive. Hours passed, and the storm didn't show any sign of slowing down. The wind howled louder, the snow piled higher. The walls of John's house shook with the force of the wind, but inside it was warm. He checked the system again, making sure the air was still circulating and everything was working smoothly. There were no issues, no leaks, and the room felt just as warm as it had when he first set it up. But as much as John felt at peace, he couldn't help but worry about the others in town. What were they doing? How were they holding up in their homes? He knew that most of them didn't have the luxury of a system like his. The houses in town were old, and many weren't built to handle this kind of storm. He could already imagine the cold creeping into their homes, the wind whistling through broken windows, the floors freezing as the heating systems failed. John knew that he was one of the lucky ones. His system had worked. But what about the others? The thought nagged at him. He stood up, pacing the room as he tried to think of what to do. He couldn't just sit here and enjoy his warmth while the others were struggling. He had a choice to make. John's mind raced. He could stay inside, safe and warm, and wait for the storm to pass. That was the easy choice, but John wasn't the kind of man to sit back and do nothing. He had always believed in helping others when they needed it most. It was who he was, and right now there were people in town who needed help. He couldn't just ignore them. But there was a problem. The storm was so fierce that it was almost impossible to leave the house. The wind was a force to be reckoned with, and the snow was coming down so hard that John couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Still, he knew he had to do something. He grabbed his coat and scarf and bundled up as best as he could. If he was going to help anyone, he needed to get out there. John opened the door and the full force of the storm hit him. The wind slammed into him like a wall, and the snow stung his face. He barely managed to close the door behind him before the wind almost knocked him over. But he kept going, pushing against the storm as he made his way through the snow-covered yard. The world outside was a blur of white, the storm so thick that it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. But John pressed on. He knew the town well. He knew where the other houses were, and he wasn't about to let the storm stop him from helping. As he trudged through the snow, John could hear the howl of the wind in his ears. His face was numb, and his hands were frozen, but he kept moving. He had to make sure everyone was okay. He had to check on his neighbors. The wind was so strong that it nearly knocked him over as he approached the first house. He pounded on the door, his hands raw from the cold. After what felt like forever, the door creaked open. A familiar face appeared in the doorway, one of John's neighbors, Mrs. Lancaster. She looked just as shocked to see him as he was to see her. "John," she asked, her voice barely audible over the howling wind, "what are you doing out here?" "I'm here to check on you," John said, trying to steady his breath. "Are you okay? How's your house holding up, Mrs. Lancaster's face softened with gratitude. "We're fine," she said, "but it's getting so cold in here. The power went out and we can't keep the house warm." John's heart sank. He had known it was bad, but hearing it firsthand made him realize just how serious the situation was. "Come inside," he said, his voice firm. "You're not staying out here in this storm." Mrs. Lancaster hesitated for a moment, but then she stepped back and allowed him to enter. John helped her close the door, blocking out the wind. The warmth from his house seemed to wash over him as he stepped inside. "I've got a heating system," John said, smiling. "It's not much, but it's working. I can keep you warm here until the storm passes." Mrs. Lancaster didn't say anything, but her eyes filled with tears. She had always known that John was a good man, but seeing him come out into the storm to help her, it meant more than words could express. As the storm raged on outside, John opened his door to other neighbors. One by one, they came in, seeking shelter from the blizzard. And with every person who came in, John's house grew warmer, not just in temperature, but in spirit. He had helped them when they needed it most. And in return, they would never forget what he had done for them. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside John's house, there was a sense of calm. The wind howled and the snow piled up in drifts, but inside it was warm and safe. John had opened his door to his neighbors, one by one, offering them shelter from the deadly blizzard. As the hours passed, more and more people came in, seeking refuge from the storm that had trapped them in their homes. At first, it was just a few families. The Thompsons, who lived down the street, were the first to knock on his door. They had heard about John's ventilation system, and they knew they needed warmth. Then came the Williams family, and then Mrs. Lancaster, who had been the first to accept John's help. One by one, they came in, seeking safety from the worst storm they had ever seen. John didn't hesitate to open the door for each of them. He welcomed them in, offering them food and blankets, and showing them to the warmth of the central room where the stove was burning bright. He made sure everyone had a place to sit, and he made sure no one was left out in the cold. The room was soon filled with the sounds of people talking, laughing, and trying to make the best of a bad situation. They were all in the same boat now. The blizzard had taken over the town, and there was no way out. The streets were impassable, the power was out, and the cold was unbearable. But inside John's house there was warmth and safety. As the storm continued outside, the house became a haven for those who had nowhere else to go. The people who had once laughed at John's crazy idea now found themselves sitting side by side with him, grateful for the warmth he had created. They could feel the heat from the stove and the air circulating through the rooms, keeping them comfortable in the midst of the harshest blizzard they had ever faced. At first, there was awkwardness. The people who had mocked John for cutting a hole in his house couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. They had thought he was foolish, and now they were the ones seeking shelter in his home. But John didn't bring it up. He didn't need to. He simply made sure they were all comfortable, offering them hot drinks and blankets, keeping them warm while the storm raged outside. The room was filled with stories and laughter, and as the night wore on, John began to notice something. The people who had once dismissed him, who had laughed at his ideas, were now starting to look at him with respect. The very thing they had mocked him for, his crazy idea of cutting a hole in his house to install a ventilation system, had turned out to be the thing that had kept them alive. They weren't saying it out loud, but John could see it in their eyes. They were grateful, and they knew that, without his system, they would be struggling to stay warm, just like everyone else in the town. The respect they had once denied him was slowly starting to change. As the hours passed, more people arrived. The storm was unrelenting, and soon the house was filled to capacity. There were people sitting on the floor, gathered around the stove, while others were in the corners, wrapped in blankets. John didn't mind. He had enough room for everyone, and he was happy to help. He had always believed that when times were tough, people needed to come together and help one another. Now, in the middle of the worst blizzard the town had ever seen, he was living that belief. Outside, the wind howled louder than ever, and the snow kept falling, but inside, John's house felt like a warm refuge. The air was circulating, the warmth from the stove was constant, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the people of the town could relax. They could sleep knowing that they weren't fighting the cold anymore. They weren't facing the blizzard alone. As the night stretched on, John found himself talking to his neighbors. He listened to their stories, their worries, and their fears. He heard about the struggles they had faced over the years, the hardships that had brought them all together. In the middle of a crisis, they had come to him for help, and now they were all here together, safe in his home. John realized that, in a way, this storm had brought the town closer together. People who had never spoken to each other before were now sharing stories and comfort in the warmth of his house. The people who had laughed at him, who had called his idea crazy, were now his guests, and they were beginning to understand just how important it was to think outside the box, to try new things when everything else seemed to be failing. But even as the house grew warmer and the people grew more comfortable, John couldn't help but think about the others. The storm was massive, and there were still families who hadn't come to him for help. What about the elderly couple who lived at the end of the road? What about the young family with a baby? Were they okay? John knew he couldn't just sit back and relax while there were still people out there struggling to survive. He decided he had to go. The storm might be fierce, but he couldn't stay inside, knowing that others were still out there, cold and alone. He put on his coat, bundled up in scarves and gloves, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Lancaster called out, her voice tinged with concern. She had been the first to accept John's help, and now she seemed worried. "I'm going to check on the others," John said, his voice firm but kind. "There are people who need help, and I can't just sit here while they're out there in the cold." Before anyone could argue, John opened the door and stepped outside. The storm hit him like a wall. The wind howled, the snow was blinding, and the air was freezing. But John didn't hesitate. He knew he had to help. He couldn't let anyone else suffer when he had the means to make a difference. As he trudged through the snow, John's thoughts were focused on the people he had left behind. He thought about the families in town, about the elderly couple, and about the young parents who might be struggling to keep their home warm. He couldn't help but worry, but he also knew that he had done everything he could to make sure his own house was a safe haven. He could only hope that the others were able to find warmth, too. John's steps were slow, but he kept going, pushing against the storm as he made his way through the snow. It felt like an eternity before he reached the first house, but he knocked on the door, determined to offer whatever help he could. When the door opened, John was greeted by the sight of a tired-looking woman holding a baby in her arms. "John," she said, surprise in her voice. "What are you doing out here?" "I came to help," John said, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Come with me, there's room at my place, you'll be safe there." The woman hesitated, glancing behind her at her small, cold home. Without saying a word, she stepped out into the storm, and John led her back to his house, where she could find warmth and comfort, just like the others. The storm had now raged for over 24 hours. John stood by the window, watching the snow fall relentlessly outside. The winds had not slowed, and the town was still buried in a thick white blanket. The streets were completely impassable, the power was out, and the world seemed to have come to a standstill. But inside John's house, it was a different story. The warmth from the stove still filled the air, circulating through the rooms thanks to the ventilation system John had created. More and more neighbors had come in for shelter. The house was filled with people, some sitting quietly, others talking softly, sharing stories of the blizzard and their lives before the storm. The air inside was warm and everyone felt safe, but outside the world was frozen in chaos. John's home had become a refuge, a beacon of warmth in the middle of a storm that showed no mercy. His neighbors, who had once laughed at him, now looked at him with respect. The system he had built had kept them alive. It had kept them warm when all other houses in town were losing heat. It wasn't a fancy solution, and it wasn't what anyone had expected. But it worked. As the hours passed, more and more people came to the house, seeking shelter from the storm. There were families who lived far out on the edge of town, and elderly couples who hadn't been able to make it to the safety of a warmer home. John had helped them all. He had opened his doors without hesitation, without a second thought. And now, with so many people under his roof, his house had become a symbol of community and survival. But despite the warmth inside, John's mind kept wandering back to the others. He thought about the elderly couple who lived by the woods. Had they made it through the storm? What about the single father and his young daughter who lived in the small cabin by the river? John had seen the look of concern in their eyes when they mentioned they didn't have much firewood left. Were they okay? He couldn't shake the thought that someone else might be out there, struggling, and he wasn't doing enough. Even as people gathered inside his home, John knew that the storm was far from over. It had already been a full day, and the forecast had predicted it could last for another 48 hours. What would happen if the supplies started running low? What if the storm got worse and people couldn't leave? John couldn't just sit back and relax. He had to do something more. He gathered everyone together in the main room, where the warmth of the stove kept everyone comfortable. The fire crackled and popped, filling the room with a cozy, comforting sound. The room was filled with voices, talking softly, telling stories of their families and homes before the storm. But John stood up, his mind focused on the task at hand. "I know everyone is safe here for now," he began, his voice steady, "but the storm is still going. It's only getting worse. We need to make sure everyone has enough food and water, and we need to keep everyone warm. If the storm continues for much longer, we could be stuck here for days." There was a murmur of agreement from the group, and some of the others started to speak up. "We've got enough supplies to last a day or two," Mrs. Lancaster said, her voice full of concern. "But after that, we'll be running low." John nodded. He had expected this. The storm was testing their resources, and it was only a matter of time before they would need to make a plan. "I'll go out tomorrow," John said firmly. "I'll check on the others and bring back more supplies if I can. It's dangerous out there, but we have to make sure no one is left behind. I can't sit here knowing that people might still be struggling." The room went silent. People exchanged worried glances. The storm outside was unlike anything they had seen in years. It wasn't just snow. It was a blizzard with fierce winds that could blow someone off their feet in an instant. It wasn't safe to go outside, but John's determination was clear. He had already helped so many, and now he was willing to go out again despite the danger. "We'll come with you," Mrs. Lancaster said, her voice firm but full of warmth. "We're all in this together." The others agreed. One by one, they spoke up, offering to join John in the search for more supplies and to check on the people who might still be stranded. Together, they could help more people, make sure everyone was safe, and bring back enough supplies to last until the storm passed. John felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had always believed that when things got tough, it was important to come together and help one another. Now, in the middle of the worst storm the town had seen, he wasn't alone. Everyone in his house had become part of his extended family, bound together by the need to survive. The group began making preparations. They gathered their coats, scarves, gloves, and any other gear they could find. The wind outside howled even louder than before, and the snow continued to fall heavily, covering everything in sight. But inside, they were ready. They had their plan, and they were determined to make it work. As they prepared to leave, John turned to the others. "We'll stick together. Stay close and don't stray too far. We'll check on everyone and then head back as quickly as we can. We don't know how long this storm will last." With that, they opened the door and the full force of the blizzard hit them. The wind whipped against their faces and the snow stung like tiny needles, but they didn't hesitate. They had a mission. They had a purpose. And they were determined to follow through. The group made their way through the snow, moving carefully, keeping close to one another. They passed houses, many of them dark and silent, the windows buried in snowdrifts. Every so often, they would hear a voice, calling out to them from behind a door or window. They would stop and check, making sure that no one was left behind, offering help and supplies to those who needed it. It wasn't long before they came across an elderly couple huddling together in their small, old home. The wind had knocked out their power, and the cold was unbearable. But with John's help, they were able to get them to safety. The couple, grateful for the warmth and shelter, couldn't stop thanking John and the others for their kindness. As the group continued their journey, they came across other homes in need. Some had running water but no heat. Some had no heat or food. One by one, John and the others offered help, making sure everyone had enough to get through the storm. By the time they made it back to John's house, the storm had started to die down. The winds had calmed and the snow had slowed. They were exhausted but triumphant. They had helped everyone they could, and now all they had to do was wait for the storm to pass. Back inside the house, the warmth of the stove felt even more comforting. The people John had helped were now part of his family. They shared food and stories, and as the night passed, they found themselves reflecting on the journey they had just taken. For John, it wasn't just about the ventilation system. It wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about the people he had helped, the bonds they had formed, and the lesson they had all learned. Sometimes the most unexpected solutions could make the biggest difference. And sometimes the people who were laughed at and underestimated were the ones who had the power to change everything. As the storm finally passed and the town began to recover, John's name became known throughout the community. People no longer mocked his ideas. Instead, they saw him for what he was, a man who had saved them all. A man who had shown them the power of thinking differently, the power of community, and the power of helping one another when the world seemed darkest.